Evacuating multiple times does not seem like an easy task. Then imagine being evacuated only because the World War II is occurring. My grandma's name is Patricia Guilford. My grandmother started the interview with, "I was born in London, England, and at the time I was born, World War II was occurring in 1939. World War II is occurring and battles and terrorizing is going on, and time after time my grandmother had to be evacuated. During the war, my grandmother remembers being evacuated at the young age of 7 and remembering being away from her family multiple times. When my grandmother was evacuated for the first time, it was from 1939 till 1942, and she was evacuated to Wiltshire, England, which is about 2 hours away from her hometown London, England. Being evacuated from London was not the easiest thing to do during my grandmother's childhood, as she was being evacuated at random times. During my grandmother's childhood, she was moved from place to place in order for her to be away from the war. Going through the war does not seem like an easy task. A few years later, when the war ended and my grandmother was out of school and was married to my grandfather, an older sister came over to the United States in 1956 with her 4 boys, and then she sent a letter to my grandmother. The sister asked in the letter if me and my husband wanted to immigrate to the U.S., since we had not had children yet and we would be the easiest to come over to the United States. My grandmother explained to me what was written in the letter. After my grandparents got the letter, they decided to go over to the U.S. in 1957. When they came to the U.S., they went back to England a couple of times, and then in the year of 1968, my grandmother said, "We decided to go back to England because work was short in the U.S." A year later, though, they decided to come back to the U.S. and only go back to England to visit family members. The difference between the U.S. and England, my grandmother pointed out, "From the top of my head, there's no class distinguished over here in the U.S. like there was in England." My grandmother said, "In England, there was your low, middle, and your high class, though over here, there is no difference. Someone could be the president of a company, though they will still speak to you." A big difference between England and the U.S. was the schools. Before the World War II, the schools in England had much smaller class sizes, though she said, "When I was evacuated and came back to the London schools, they were bigger class sizes. Schools in England seem much more overwhelming compared to the U.S. In 1969, when my grandmother was much older and the war ended, it was when my grandparents decided to stay in the U.S. My grandparents would only go back to England to visit family members and visit their hometown. At the end of the interview, my grandmother smiled and looked at me and said, "But there is no place like the U.S."